Pay attention to this footage captured by a local fisherman in Bali, Indonesia. You're looking at something that's never been seen before, a massive deep-sea creature being hauled onto land by heavy machinery. Look closely at the pale, bloated body, the strange mouth structure, the sheer impossible size of it. Notice the officials surrounding it, the military-grade equipment being used to move it. This isn't a whale. This isn't anything documented in marine biology. And when scientists cut it open, what they found inside would trigger an international investigation into one of the most disturbing criminal conspiracies ever uncovered. 30 bodies, 3 missing ships, and a trail that led straight to someone who'd been using the ocean's darkest depths as the perfect murder weapon. You know that feeling when you're standing at the edge of the ocean, looking out at all that endless water, and you realize just how small you are? How little we actually know about what's down there. For the families of the Rosa del Mar, that vastness became a nightmare they're still living through. Captain Eduardo Santos had been fishing the waters off the coast of Malaysia for 23 years. His vessel, the Rosa del Mar, wasn't fancy, just a sturdy fishing boat that had seen better days but kept his crew of 8 fed and their families comfortable back home in the Philippines. Eduardo was the kind of man who knew the sea like he knew his own heartbeat. He could read weather patterns most meteorologists would miss. He understood currents, migrations, the subtle shifts in color that told you where the fish were running. His wife, Carmen, used to joke that he loved that boat more than he loved her. She'd laugh when she said it, but there was truth underneath the humor. Eduardo was happiest out there on the water, radio crackling with chatter from other vessels, the smell of salt and diesel mixing in the air. Their daughter, Isabella, was 17 and planning to go to university to study marine biology. She wanted to understand the ocean the way her father did, but through science instead of instinct. The crew of the Rosa del Mar were like family. First mate Miguel Reyes had worked with Eduardo for 12 years. There was young Antonio Cruz, just 19 and eager to prove himself. The oldest crew member, Fernando Diaz, was 62 and planning to retire at the end of the season. Each of them had families waiting for them to come home. Nobody could have known that when the Rosa del Mar left port on March 7th, 2017, not a single person aboard would ever be seen alive again. The morning Eduardo's boat left port was unremarkable. Clear skies, calm seas, the kind of weather that made fishing feel less like work and more like meditation. Carmen had packed Eduardo's favorite breakfast, rice with dried fish and eggs, and kissed him goodbye the way she had thousands of times before. Isabella had already left for school. Everything was completely, beautifully normal. The Rosa del Mar was heading to a spot about 40 nautical miles off the Malaysian coast, near the edge of an underwater trench that dropped down nearly 3,000 meters. The fishing was always good there. Eduardo had radioed 2 other vessels that morning, the Sea Dragon and Pacific Dream, comparing notes on where the tuna were running. His voice was relaxed, joking with the other captains about whose boat needed more repairs. The last confirmed communication from the Rosa del Mar came at 11:47 a.m. on March 8th. Eduardo had checked in with Maritime Traffic Control, reporting his position and confirming everything was fine. Weather was holding, catch was decent, they'd be heading back to port the next morning. Then nothing. When the Rosa del Mar didn't return to port on March 10th, Carmen wasn't immediately worried. Boats stayed out longer than planned all the time. If the fishing was good, if weather delayed them, if equipment needed repairs. She tried Eduardo's satellite phone and got no answer, but signals could be spotty out there. It wasn't until March 11th, when Miguel's wife called her in a panic, that Carmen felt the first real grip of fear. Neither of their husbands had checked in. None of the crew had made contact. The boat's emergency beacon wasn't transmitting. The Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency launched a search and rescue operation on March 12th. Coast Guard vessels covered hundreds of square miles. Helicopters swept the area where the Rosa del Mar had last reported its position. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no life rafts, no bodies. The ocean had simply swallowed the boat and everyone on it without leaving a trace. But here's the thing that made investigators uneasy. This wasn't the first disappearance. 6 weeks earlier, on January 18, 2017, a cargo ship called the Eastern Star had vanished in roughly the same area. The vessel had been transporting electronics and textiles from Taiwan to Singapore when it stopped responding to radio calls. The ship was carrying a crew of 14. Like the Rosa del Mar, the Eastern Star left no evidence of what happened, no distress call, no emergency beacon, just gone. At the time, authorities had assumed some kind of catastrophic event, maybe a rogue wave, maybe an explosion in the engine room. The ocean is unforgiving, and sometimes ships just go down fast, especially older vessels that might not be properly maintained. The Eastern Star was 40 years old. Maybe her hull had failed, maybe she'd hit something. Tragic, but not exactly unprecedented. Except now there were 2 vessels missing in the same general area within 2 months. That wasn't a coincidence anymore. That was a pattern. And then came the Horizon Explorer. The Horizon Explorer was different from the first 2 vessels. This was a legitimate research ship operated by a marine biology institute based in Singapore. State-of-the-art equipment, modern safety systems, a crew of 15 scientists and support staff who were studying deep-sea ecosystems in the trench. These weren't fishermen or merchant mariners. These were educated professionals with families, degrees, and research grants. Dr. Melissa Chen was the lead scientist aboard the Horizon Explorer. She had a doctorate from Oxford and had published extensively on bioluminescent organisms in extreme ocean depths. Her colleague, Dr. James Park, was a specialist in underwater geology. They'd been planning this expedition for 18 months, securing funding, assembling the team, coordinating with international research partners. The Horizon Explorer left Singapore on April 2, 2017. They were scheduled to return on April 16th. Dr. Chen had been posting updates on the Research Institute's website, sharing photos of the team, talking enthusiastically about preliminary findings. Her last post went up on April 8th. It showed several team members on deck smiling, giving thumbs up to the camera. The caption read, "Day 6. Incredible bioluminescent samples collected from 2,400 meters. This is why we do what we do." On April 9th, the Horizon Explorer missed its scheduled check-in with the Institute. The operations coordinator tried the ship's multiple communication systems. Nothing. They waited, tried again. Silence. By April 10th, they'd contacted Malaysian and Indonesian maritime authorities. The search for the Horizon Explorer was more extensive than the previous 2. This was a research vessel with international funding and high-profile scientists aboard. News media started paying attention. Families of the missing crew members gave tearful interviews. Dr. Chen's husband stood in front of cameras begging for any information. Search teams covered a massive area. Military vessels from 3 countries participated. Satellite imagery was analyzed. Sonar scans swept the ocean floor. And once again, they found absolutely nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no debris field. 15 people had simply ceased to exist. By mid-April 2017, 37 people from 3 different vessels had vanished in the same general area of ocean. The press started calling it the Asian Triangle, drawing comparisons to the Bermuda Triangle. Theories proliferated online: freak weather phenomena, underwater volcanic activity, even speculation about magnetic anomalies that could interfere with navigation equipment. But the families didn't want theories. They wanted answers. Carmen Santos organized the other families. She became the face of the missing, giving interviews, pushing authorities to expand the search, refusing to accept that her husband and daughter's father was just gone. Miguel's wife, Rosa, joined her. Together, they represented 37 families who were stuck in an unbearable limbo, not knowing if their loved ones were dead, if they'd suffered, if there was any chance they might still be alive somewhere. The psychological torture of not knowing is something most people can't comprehend. Grief has a shape to it when you know someone is dead. You can mourn, you can move through the stages, you can eventually find some kind of acceptance. But this was different. Every time Carmen's phone rang, her heart would jump. Every time there was a knock on the door, she thought maybe it was news. Maybe they'd been found. Maybe Eduardo would walk through the door with some incredible survival story. Isabella stopped going to school. She'd sit in her room for hours, looking at photos of her father, trying to make sense of how someone could just disappear. The other families were falling apart in similar ways. Marriages were crumbling under the stress. Children were developing anxiety and depression. Some families hired private investigators. Others turned to psychics and mediums, desperate for any kind of closure. The media coverage was relentless at first, but as weeks passed without any developments, the story faded from headlines. Other news took priority. The families felt abandoned, like the world had moved on while they were still trapped in that moment when the ships vanished. Carmen gave interview after interview, desperate to keep the pressure on authorities, to keep the search alive. But she could see it in their eyes. The investigators, the officials, they were losing hope. They thought the families needed to accept that their loved ones were gone. And then, on May 3rd, 2017, fishermen working off the coast of Bali hauled in something that would change everything. At first, they thought their nets had snagged on a submarine or some piece of underwater wreckage. The weight was enormous, pulling their boat sideways. It took 3 other vessels and nearly 5 hours to bring it to the surface. When it finally broke through the water, the fishermen couldn't process what they were seeing. It looked almost like a massive ray or skate, but wrong. The body was pale, almost translucent in places, bloated to an impossible size. The creature measured over 14 meters from end to end. Its mouth was a gaping cavity lined with rows of needle-like teeth that curved inward. The eyes were clouded over, lifeless. The skin had a gelatinous quality, and there were strange structures along its sides that looked almost mechanical. The fishermen towed the creature to shore, where local authorities immediately cordoned off the area. Word spread fast. Marine biologists arrived from Jakarta within hours. The military showed up shortly after. Someone had the presence of mind to document everything with photographs and video, footage that would later become crucial evidence. Dr. Sari Wijaya, a marine biologist from the University of Indonesia, was one of the first scientists on scene. She'd seen a lot of strange things pulled from deep water over her career, but nothing like this. The creature didn't match any known species. The size alone was unprecedented for this type of organism, but what really caught her attention were the objects embedded in its flesh. "There are foreign materials here," she told the military officers standing nearby. "This isn't natural. Someone put these things inside this animal." When they performed the necropsy the next day, Dr. Wijaya's hands were shaking as she made the first incision. The smell was overwhelming, decomposition mixed with something chemical, almost industrial. As they opened the creature's massive stomach cavity, one of the assisting researchers vomited. Others stepped back, hands over their mouths. Inside the creature's digestive system were fragments of boats, pieces of hull with paint still visible, sections of deck railing, a ship's wheel, electronic equipment, and scattered among the debris were personal items, a waterproof watch, a gold chain, a pair of glasses, a wedding ring. But what stopped everyone cold were the bones. Human bones, ribs, femurs, skulls, dozens of them in various stages of decomposition. Some still had soft tissue attached. The creature's stomach acid had been working on them, but not long enough to completely dissolve everything. Dr. Wijaya immediately contacted the Indonesian National Police. This wasn't just a strange marine biology discovery anymore. This was a crime scene, a mass grave. The creature's stomach contained evidence of at least 30 human beings. The discovery of the creature and its horrific stomach contents triggered an international investigation the likes of which Southeast Asian law enforcement had never seen. Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Taiwan all had citizens among the missing. Interpol got involved. Maritime security agencies from a dozen countries started sharing intelligence. The creature's body was transported to a secure facility in Jakarta, where a team of forensic specialists and marine biologists could examine it properly. Dr. Wijaya led the marine biology side of things. Detective Inspector Marcus Tan from the Singapore Police Force headed up the criminal investigation. He'd worked homicide for 15 years, but never anything like this. "We're not just looking at deaths," Tan told reporters at a press conference. "We're looking at a deliberate pattern of disappearances. Whatever happened to these vessels wasn't accidental. The first priority was identifying the remains. Forensic anthropologists worked carefully to catalog every bone fragment, every piece of tissue. DNA samples were collected and sent to labs in Singapore and Jakarta. The personal items were photographed and documented, each one a heartbreaking link to someone who'd been alive just weeks earlier. The wedding ring found in the creature's stomach had an inscription inside: Eduardo and Carmen, forever. Carmen Santos identified it immediately when police showed her photographs. That ring had been on her husband's finger for 20 years. Seeing it confirmed what she'd been trying not to accept: Eduardo was dead. The Rosa del Mar was one of the vessels this creature had consumed. Other families identified items too. A watch belonged to Dr. James Park from the Horizon Explorer. A pair of distinctive glasses matched those worn by one of the crew members from the Eastern Star. DNA analysis would take weeks, but the physical evidence was already telling the story. All three missing vessels had ended up in this creature's stomach. But the question that haunted everyone was how. Deep-sea creatures occasionally attack boats. There are documented cases of giant squids damaging vessels, of sharks biting into hulls. But this? 3 different ships, ranging from a small fishing boat to a research vessel, all consumed by the same creature? That wasn't natural predation. That was something else entirely. The breakthrough came when Dr. Wijaya and her team examined the foreign objects embedded in the creature's tissue. There were 12 devices in total, each about the size of a small phone, encased in waterproof titanium housings. They'd been surgically implanted at regular intervals along the creature's body. "These are tracking devices," explained Dr. Raymond Foster, an electronics specialist brought in from Australia. "High-grade GPS units with satellite uplink capability. Someone was monitoring this animal's location in real time." That revelation was chilling. This wasn't a random series of tragedies. Someone had been tracking this creature's movements. Someone knew where it was going. The implications were staggering. The devices were manufactured by a company called Tech Marine Solutions, based in South Korea. When investigators contacted the company, they learned the devices had been purchased in February 2015, nearly 2 years before the first disappearance, by a research organization called the Pacific Deep Sea Institute. Except when authorities tried to contact the Pacific Deep Sea Institute, they hit a wall. The organization existed only on paper. It had a website, official-looking documentation, even a mailing address in Singapore. But the office was just a mail forwarding service. The phone numbers were disconnected. The scientists listed on the website either didn't exist or had their identities stolen. The Pacific Deep Sea Institute was a shell, a front for something much darker. Detective Inspector Tan assembled a task force. Financial investigators started tracing the money used to purchase the tracking devices. Maritime records specialists began analyzing the routes and positions of the missing vessels. Marine biologists worked to understand the creature itself, what it was, where it had come from, how it had been controlled. Dr. Wijaya made a disturbing discovery when she examined the creature's brain tissue. There were signs of surgical intervention, scarring, foreign materials, evidence of electrodes that had been implanted deep in the neural tissue. "Someone modified this animal," she told the task force. "They implanted devices in its brain. This wasn't just tracking, this was control. Someone was directing its behavior." Think about that for a moment. Someone had captured a massive deep-sea creature, performed sophisticated neurosurgery on it, implanted tracking and control systems, and then used it as a weapon to destroy ships and kill dozens of people. This was beyond criminal. It was monstrous. But who would do something like this? And why? The answer started to come together when investigators traced the vessel movements in the days before each disappearance. Maritime traffic control keeps detailed records of every ship's position, especially in busy waters. When the task force analyzed those records, they found something odd. Each of the 3 missing vessels had deviated from their planned routes in the 24 to 48 hours before they vanished. The Eastern Star had adjusted course on January 16th. The Rosa del Mar had changed direction on March 7th. The Horizon Explorer had modified its research grid on April 7th, and in each case, the new coordinates took them directly into the path of the creature. They were being guided, Tan said. Someone was telling these vessels where to go, leading them straight to that thing. The question was who? Who had the access to communicate with these ships? Who could convince a cargo vessel, a fishing boat, and a research ship to all change course? Financial investigators found the first real lead when they traced payments associated with the Pacific Deep Sea Institute. The money had moved through several shell corporations and offshore accounts, but eventually they tracked it back to a single source, a man named Dr. Victor Ashford. Dr. Victor Ashford was a marine biologist with an impressive resume. PhD from Cambridge, published researcher, former professor at several prestigious universities. He'd done legitimate work in the field of deep-sea biology, specifically studying how extreme pressure and darkness affected creature behavior and evolution. He'd even consulted for military programs exploring biomechanical integration, using living organisms as platforms for technology. But Ashford had been fired from his last academic position in 2014 after allegations of ethical violations in his research. He'd been experimenting on live animals in ways that violated protocols, pushing boundaries that made his colleagues uncomfortable. After his firing, he'd disappeared from the academic world. Nobody knew where he'd gone or what he'd been doing. Until now. Investigators discovered that Ashford had been living in Thailand, operating under multiple aliases. He'd maintained contact with several research facilities and had access to maritime communication networks through connections he'd built during his academic career. And here's where it gets really twisted. Ashford had been offering his services to anyone who wanted to make ships disappear. The task force uncovered emails and encrypted messages where Ashford had communicated with potential clients. He was essentially running a murder-for-hire operation, but instead of using conventional methods, he'd weaponized a deep-sea creature. For the right price, he would guide ships into the creature's path. The ocean was so vast, the depth so unexplored, that he believed bodies would never be found. It was the perfect crime. And he'd been right, until those Indonesian fishermen had accidentally caught his weapon in their nets. The Eastern Star had been carrying illegal cargo, weapons and contraband being smuggled from Taiwan. The cargo's owners had wanted the ship and its crew eliminated to destroy evidence of the smuggling operation. They'd paid Ashford $500,000. The Rosa del Mar was harder to figure out at first. Why would anyone want to destroy a simple fishing boat? The answer came from intercepted communications between Ashford and a criminal organization in Manila. Eduardo Santos had witnessed something he shouldn't have. A drug transfer between vessels back in December 2016. He'd reported it to authorities, providing enough information to bust a major trafficking operation. The cartel wanted revenge and wanted it untraceable. They paid Ashford $200,000. And the Horizon Explorer? That was the most disturbing of all. The research vessel was mapping the ocean floor in an area where illegal mining operations were being planned. The mining company didn't want that area surveyed or documented. They wanted those scientists and their data eliminated. They'd paid Ashford $1.2 million. 37 people had died because they'd become inconvenient to criminals and corrupt corporations. Their deaths had been purchased like any other service, and Ashford had delivered, using a creature pulled from the deepest parts of the ocean, modified and controlled like a living weapon. The families were informed of these discoveries in private meetings with investigators. Carmen Santos learned that her husband had been murdered because he'd tried to do the right thing. He'd seen criminal activity and reported it, and the cartel had decided his life was worth less than their business. The rage Carmen felt was indescribable. Eduardo had been a good man, an honest man, and that honesty had gotten him killed. Dr. Chen's husband learned that Melissa and her entire team had been eliminated because they'd been doing their jobs too well, gathering data that would have interfered with corporate profits. 15 brilliant scientists gone because some mining executives decided environmental research was bad for business. The families of the Eastern Star crew learned their loved ones had died simply because they'd been working on the wrong ship at the wrong time. They hadn't done anything wrong. hadn't witnessed anything, hadn't threatened anyone. They'd just been crew members on a vessel carrying illegal cargo, and they'd been considered acceptable collateral damage. The families were informed of these discoveries in private meetings with investigators. Carmen Santos learned that her husband had been murdered because he'd tried to do the right thing. He'd seen criminal activity and reported it, and the cartel had decided his life was worth less than their business. The rage Carmen felt was indescribable. Eduardo had been a good man, an honest man, and that honesty had gotten him killed. Dr. Chen's husband learned that Melissa and her entire team had been eliminated because they'd been doing their jobs too well, gathering data that would have interfered with corporate profits. 15 brilliant scientists, gone, because some mining executives decided environmental research was bad for business. The families of the Eastern Star crew learned their loved ones had died simply because they'd been working on the wrong ship at the wrong time. They hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't witnessed anything, hadn't threatened anyone. They'd just been crew members on a vessel carrying illegal cargo, and they'd been considered acceptable collateral damage. The psychological impact of these revelations was devastating. It's one thing to lose someone to an accident, to natural disaster, to random tragedy, but to learn that your loved one was deliberately murdered, that their death was ordered and paid for, that someone sat in an office somewhere and decided they needed to die, that's a different kind of trauma entirely. The manhunt for Victor Ashford became international news. His face was everywhere. Television, newspapers, online. Tips poured in from around the world. He'd been spotted in Thailand, in Cambodia, in Indonesia. Every lead was followed, but Ashford stayed one step ahead. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued their work on the creature and the evidence recovered from it. They found Captain Eduardo's logbook, partially dissolved but still partially readable. The final entry, written on March 8th, was chilling. Received coordinates from V. Constantine for better fishing grounds. Miguel is skeptical, but the pay is too good to ignore. We're changing course. Carmen, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. The money, it was supposed to be for Isabella's school. Eduardo had been tricked. Someone claiming to be Victor Constantine, one of Ashford's many aliases, had contacted him, offering to pay him for helping with some kind of marine research. All Eduardo had to do was sail to specific coordinates at a specific time. Eduardo, always thinking of his family's future, had agreed. He'd led his entire crew straight to their deaths, never knowing he was the target, never understanding that the research opportunity was actually his execution. That logbook entry broke Carmen's heart all over again. Eduardo had been trying to provide for them. He'd been thinking of Isabella's education, of their future, right up until the end, and he'd been manipulated, used, led to slaughter like livestock. Similar communications were found related to the other vessels. The Eastern Star's captain had received route modifications from someone claiming to be from the shipping company's headquarters. The Horizon Explorer had been given new survey coordinates by someone posing as a representative from their funding agency. Ashford had been careful, thorough, establishing trust before leading his victims to the creature. The investigation also revealed how Ashford had controlled the creature. The neural implants transmitted electromagnetic signals that triggered specific responses. The creature had been conditioned, like Pavlov's dogs, to associate certain signals with feeding opportunities. When Ashford transmitted the signal, the creature would rise from the depths, entering a feeding frenzy. Ships in the vicinity didn't stand a chance. Dr. Wijaya's team determined that the creature was naturally a deep-dwelling predator, adapted to hunt in complete darkness at extreme pressures. Ashford had captured it using deep-sea submersibles and specialized nets, then kept it in an underwater holding facility where he'd performed the surgical modifications. He'd essentially created a remote-controlled killing machine from a living organism. The ethical implications were staggering. Ashford hadn't just committed murder, he'd violated every principle of scientific research, every ethical boundary that governed the treatment of animals. He'd caused the creature immense suffering, turning it into something unnatural, forcing it to participate in his crimes. The creature itself was as much a victim as the people it had killed. For 3 months after the creature's discovery, Ashford managed to evade capture. He moved between countries, using fake passports and forged documents. But the international manhunt was closing in. Interpol had agents tracking his financial transactions. Intelligence agencies were monitoring communications. Border security had his photo flagged everywhere. The break came from an unexpected source. A woman named Elena Volkov contacted authorities in July 2017. She'd been Ashford's research assistant years ago, back when he was still working at the university. She'd left his lab after witnessing the ethical violations that would eventually get him fired. Experiments on animals that crossed every line imaginable. Elena had seen the news about the creature and the murders. She'd recognized the surgical techniques used to implant the control devices. She knew Ashford's work, knew his obsessions with controlling deep-sea organisms. And she'd been living with guilt, wondering if she could have prevented this if she'd spoken up more forcefully years ago. He kept detailed records of everything, Elena told Detective Inspector Tan. Every experiment, every procedure, every modification he made to animals. He documented it all because he thought he was doing groundbreaking work. He thought history would vindicate him. Elena provided locations where Ashford might have stored his research, backup sites he'd mentioned years ago. One location was in a storage facility in Bangkok. When Thai police raided it, they found computers, hard drives, notebooks, years of research documenting Ashford's descent from legitimate scientist to criminal mastermind. The records were damning. They showed how Ashford had captured the creature in mid-2015 using deep-sea nets and specialized equipment. He'd kept it in an underwater facility, essentially a submerged cage in a remote part of the Pacific. He'd performed the surgeries there, implanting the tracking devices and neural control systems. He'd trained the creature to respond to specific electromagnetic signals that would trigger aggressive feeding behavior. The creature itself was a species never before documented, some kind of massive deep-sea predator that normally lived at depths humans rarely explored. Ashford had brought it to shallower waters, starving it, conditioning it, turning it into his weapon. The records also contained Ashford's communications with his clients, his financial accounts, and most critically, his current location. He'd been hiding in Myanmar, in a remote coastal area where he'd set up another laboratory. He was planning to capture and modify another creature to restart his operation. The most disturbing part of Ashford's records was what they revealed about his long-term plans. He'd been developing a network of controlled creatures, positioning them in different parts of the ocean. The creature caught off Bali was just the first successful deployment. He had notes about capturing specimens in the Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean, even in the Arctic waters. He was building an invisible fleet of biological weapons that could be activated anywhere in the world. His client list was extensive and terrifying. Criminal organizations, corrupt governments, corporate entities willing to pay for untraceable eliminations. Ashford had positioned himself as the ultimate contractor for maritime murder. The scope of what he was planning went far beyond the 37 people who'd already died. An international task force coordinated the arrest. Myanmar authorities, working with Interpol agents, surrounded Ashford's compound on August 15, 2017. The compound was isolated, accessible only by boat, hidden in a network of small islands and mangrove forests. Ashford had chosen it specifically for its remoteness and the difficulty of surveillance. The tactical team moved in at dawn. They expected resistance. Ashford had the resources and motivation to fight. But when they breached the compound, they found him calmly sitting at his desk, writing in a notebook. He barely looked up when armed officers entered the room. "I wondered when you'd arrive," he said, setting down his pen. "Did you bring the creature's carcass? There's still so much to learn from the neural integration patterns." He tried to run when they moved to restrain him, tried to reach a boat he had waiting at a nearby dock, but there was nowhere to go. The task force had surrounded the entire area. After months on the run, after years of planning and executing murders, Victor Ashford was finally in custody. His arrest made global headlines. The scope of his crimes, the brutality of his methods, the sheer audacity of using a living creature as a murder weapon, it was unprecedented. News outlets called him everything from the ocean's monster to the deep sea killer. True crime documentaries were already being planned before his trial even began. Ashford was extradited to Indonesia, where many of the victims' families were based and where the creature had been discovered. The legal process took months as prosecutors from multiple countries coordinated their cases, ensuring that Ashford would face justice for every crime he'd committed. During interrogation, Ashford showed no remorse. He talked about his work with pride, like he was discussing a scientific breakthrough instead of mass murder. He explained in clinical detail how he'd modified the creature, how he'd directed it to specific coordinates, how he'd monitored it consuming the vessels. He spoke about the 37 people who died like they were test subjects, data points in his grand experiment. "They don't understand what I accomplished," he told investigators. "I bridged the gap between biology and technology. I proved that deep-sea organisms could be controlled, weaponized. The applications for this are limitless. Military defense, border protection, environmental management. This technology could have changed everything." The investigators sitting across from him had to maintain professional composure. But inside, they were revolted. This wasn't a scientist. This was a psychopath who'd found a way to dress up his cruelty in academic language. "What about the families?" one investigator asked. "The children who lost parents? The parents who lost children?" Ashford shrugged. "Collateral damage is an unfortunate reality of any significant advancement. The people who died were necessary sacrifices for the greater scientific achievement." That statement would be quoted extensively during his trial. It revealed the depth of his depravity, his complete inability to recognize the humanity of his victims. The evidence against Ashford was overwhelming. The financial records showed payments from his clients. The communications proved he'd been directing the vessels into the creature's path. The research documents detailed every aspect of his operation. The tracking devices recovered from the creature matched his specifications exactly. The neural implants bore his surgical signature, techniques he'd pioneered in his earlier legitimate research. Even the footage captured by the fishermen in Bali, showing the creature being hauled onto land, the first visual evidence of what had killed 37 people, was part of the case against him. That footage, which seemed so strange when it first surfaced, now made perfect sense. The pale, bloated body, the mechanical structures visible on its sides, the massive size. This was Ashford's creation, his weapon, his proof of concept that living things could be turned into tools of murder. When investigators finally identified all the clients who'd hired Ashford, the smugglers behind the Eastern Star sinking, the cartel that wanted Eduardo Santos dead, the mining company that ordered the destruction of the Horizon Explorer, it led to arrests across 4 countries. Criminal organizations were dismantled, corrupt corporate executives were charged. The scope of the conspiracy reached far beyond just one mad scientist. The trial preparation revealed even more horrors. Ashford's research suggested he'd been working on this project for nearly a decade. The creature found off Bali wasn't his first attempt. It was simply the first one that survived long enough and functioned well enough to be deployed operationally. His notes referenced at least 7 other creatures he'd captured and modified, each one dying during or shortly after the surgical procedures. He'd learned from each failure, refined his techniques, improved his control systems. And the question that kept investigators up at night was, how many other deaths might be connected to Ashford's experiments? How many ships had gone missing over the years, written off as accidents or natural disasters, that might actually have been his early trials? Maritime records showed dozens of unexplained disappearances in the regions where Ashford had been operating. Some dated back to 2012, just after he'd been fired from his university position. They may never know the full scope of his crimes. The ocean keeps its secrets, and Ashford had been careful in his early experiments to leave no evidence behind. Only his final, most successful deployment had been accidentally discovered. The families of the victims attended every court hearing. Carmen Santos sat in the front row with Isabella, who had turned 18 during the investigation. Rosa Reyes was there, representing her husband Miguel and his crew. Dr. Chen's husband attended every session, taking notes, documenting everything for the foundation he'd established in his wife's memory. The trial lasted 6 weeks and attracted international media attention. Prosecutors presented hundreds of pieces of evidence: financial records, communications, research notes, forensic analysis, witness testimony from Elena Volkov and other former colleagues who could speak to Ashford's deteriorating ethics and increasing obsession with control. The defense tried multiple strategies. They argued that Ashford couldn't be held responsible for the creature's actions, that he'd simply been conducting research and couldn't control what the organism did once it was in the wild. They claimed the deaths were unintended consequences of legitimate scientific inquiry. They even tried to argue that Ashford's mental state had deteriorated, that he wasn't fully responsible for his actions. Nobody bought it. The evidence of premeditation was too clear. The financial transactions, the careful planning, the communication with clients, this wasn't the work of someone conducting research or operating under diminished capacity. This was deliberate, calculated murder for profit. Expert witnesses testified about the sophistication of Ashford's work. The neural implants alone required advanced knowledge of neurosurgery, electrical engineering, and deep-sea biology. The tracking system demonstrated expertise in satellite communications and GPS technology. This wasn't someone who'd lost touch with reality. This was someone who'd deliberately chosen to use his considerable skills for evil. The jury heard from forensic specialists who'd analyzed the remains found in the creature's stomach. They heard from maritime experts who explained how the vessels had been led to their doom. They heard from financial investigators who'd traced the money from clients to Ashford's accounts. They heard from Elena Volkov, who described watching Ashford cross ethical boundaries years before the murders, who'd tried to stop him and failed. And they heard from the families. Carmen Santos gave testimony about Eduardo, about the kind of man he'd been, about how his murder had destroyed their family. Isabella spoke about losing her father, about the nightmares she still had, about how she couldn't look at the ocean anymore without thinking of how he'd died. Dr. Chen's husband described his wife's passion for science, her dedication to understanding and protecting ocean ecosystems. The irony that she'd been killed by someone who'd perverted marine biology into a weapon wasn't lost on anyone in that courtroom. Representatives from the other families spoke about the people they'd lost. Fernando Diaz, who'd been counting down the days to retirement. Antonio Cruz, barely out of his teenage years. The crew members of the Eastern Star, migrants who'd been trying to support families back home. The scientists aboard the Horizon Explorer, each with their own dreams and contributions to make to the world. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on every count. Guilty. Victor Ashford was convicted on all counts. 37 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of destruction of maritime vessels, multiple charges related to illegal weapons development, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and operating a criminal enterprise. Animal cruelty charges for the torture and weaponization of the deep-sea creature. The list went on and on. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, to be served in Indonesia's maximum security facility in Nusa Kambangan, known locally as Alcatraz Island. The sentences for all 37 murders were to run consecutively, meaning that even if some miracle granted him parole, he would have to serve well over 1,000 years. "You treated human lives as if they were nothing more than variables in an experiment," the judge said during sentencing. "You weaponized nature itself in service of greed and ego. You perverted science, violated every ethical principle that governs research and human decency. The sentences I'm imposing today can never bring back the people you killed, can never heal the families you destroyed, can never undo the suffering you've caused. But you will spend the rest of your life behind bars, and the world will know what you are. Not a scientist, not a researcher, but a murderer who used his knowledge to inflict unimaginable horror." Ashford showed no emotion during sentencing. He stared straight ahead, his mind already somewhere else. Even in that moment, he didn't seem to grasp the enormity of what he'd done, the lives he'd destroyed, the families he'd shattered. His clients, the smugglers, the cartel members, the mining executives, also faced justice. The man who ordered Eduardo Santos killed, a cartel boss named Rafael Mendez, received a 25-year sentence in the Philippines. The corporate executives behind the Horizon Explorer attack, including CEO Thomas Brennan and Operations Director Sarah Yates, got 15 years each in Singapore. The smuggling operation behind the Eastern Star sinking resulted in multiple life sentences across Taiwan and mainland China. The creature itself remains in a preserved state at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences, where it's studied by marine biologists trying to understand what species it was and how it survived at such extreme depths. Dr. Wijaya continues to publish research based on the necropsy findings, hoping that some scientific good can come from such a terrible tragedy. The devices implanted in its body have been sent to various research institutions where engineers study them to better understand how to detect similar technologies in the future. Carmen Santos used the settlement money from the lawsuit against Ashford and his clients to establish the Eduardo Santos Maritime Safety Foundation. The organization advocates for better tracking of vessels, improved communication systems, and international cooperation on ocean crime. They've successfully lobbied for new regulations requiring additional safety protocols for fishing vessels and have helped provide financial assistance to families of missing mariners. Isabella eventually went to university, studying criminal justice instead of marine biology. The ocean that had fascinated her as a child now represented only pain and loss. She's determined to work in law enforcement to prevent other families from experiencing what hers did. She interns with the Maritime Safety Foundation her mother created, channeling her grief into purpose. Dr. Chen's husband, David, still runs the foundation in her name. The Melissa Chen Foundation for Marine Research provides scholarships for marine biology students and funds research into protecting ocean ecosystems from criminal exploitation. The foundation has become one of the leading voices in maritime security reform, working with governments and international organizations to prevent the kind of weaponization Ashford achieved. The families of the Eastern Star crew received compensation, though no amount of money can replace a lost father, husband, or son. Many of them used the funds to improve their children's education, to give them opportunities their lost loved ones had worked so hard to provide. Several family members have become advocates for migrant worker rights, ensuring that crew members on cargo ships have better protections and support systems. The investigation revealed something else troubling. There are likely other people out there with the knowledge and motivation to weaponize marine life. Ashford wasn't unique. He was just the first one caught. Maritime security agencies now monitor for the kind of patterns that revealed his crimes, watching for ships that deviate from their routes, for unusual concentrations of disappearances, for any signs that the ocean's depths are being turned into weapons. New technologies have been developed to detect the kind of tracking devices found in Ashford's creature. International protocols now require more rigorous oversight of deep-sea research operations. The scientific community has implemented stronger ethical review processes, trying to prevent another researcher from going down Ashford's path. But the ocean is vast, covering more than 70% of Earth's surface. Its deepest parts remain largely unexplored, largely unknown. And in that darkness, there could be anything. Anyone could be conducting experiments, developing weapons, using the ocean's isolation as cover for crimes humanity can barely imagine. The families of the 37 victims want people to remember that their loved ones weren't just statistics, weren't just names in a news story. They were real people with dreams and families and futures that were stolen by a man who saw them as nothing more than test subjects. Eduardo Santos was a father who wanted to see his daughter graduate, who worked hard every day to provide for his family, who tried to do the right thing even when it cost him. Dr. Melissa Chen was a scientist on the verge of breakthrough discoveries. Passionate about protecting the ocean, she spent her life studying. Fernando Diaz was looking forward to retirement, to spending time with his grandchildren, to the rest of his life after decades of hard work. Antonio Cruz was just starting out, full of hopes and dreams about the future. Each of the 37 had lives that mattered, had people who loved them, had plans for tomorrow that would never come. They were victims of a crime that shouldn't have been possible, killed by a weapon that shouldn't have existed, murdered by a man who chose his own ambition over their lives. This case changed how we think about maritime crime, about the intersection of technology and biology, about how vast and unexplored the ocean really is. It revealed that the depths can hide more than just unknown species. They can hide the darkest human intentions. It showed that science without ethics, knowledge without conscience, can create horrors beyond imagination. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but sometimes those secrets surface, dragged up in a fisherman's net off the coast of Bali, and the truth comes with them, ugly, brutal, undeniable. And when that happens, when the depths give up their dead and their evidence, justice, however incomplete, however insufficient, can finally be served. 37 families can finally lay their loved ones to rest, knowing that the man who killed them will never walk free, will never harm anyone else, will spend the rest of his days in a cell thinking about what he's done. Whether that brings them peace is another question entirely. Some wounds never fully heal. Some losses never stop hurting. But at least they have answers. At least they know what happened. At least they can honor their loved ones' memories with the truth, however terrible that truth might be. 37 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of willful destruction of maritime vessels, illegal development and deployment of biological weapons, conspiracy to commit murder, operating a criminal enterprise, multiple counts of fraud and identity theft, illegal animal experimentation and extreme animal cruelty, money laundering, forgery and falsification of documents, obstruction of justice.